I'm going to pick up on page 31 here, but I'll scroll through the early part of this lesson fairly quickly because we got a foot in the door with it last week. The class is God Speaks, and it's a controversial class because I've taught it at the old church and at other places, but the idea is that God speaks in many, many different ways. Now, one of the lessons is devoted to the Bible. But within Protestant circles, a lot of Protestant circles, that would be the only lesson I taught. Because everybody knows God is a retired author and that he wrote his book, and that's the only place that he has anything to say. I've never really believed that. Now, I do, as a Protestant, believe that we need to be biblical. And so we can't get carried away with all kinds of strange ideas and traditions. The Bible is a benchmark against which to test our theology and our doctrine. But that shades over in some churches, quite a few of them that I've been to, where that's the only place God speaks. I always felt that that's a tragedy because none of the saints of the last 2,000 years have ever felt that way. They've seen God in nature. They've felt God's voice speak through their conscience. They've longed for Him in their personal, private experience. Traditions of the church play an incredible role in seeking out God's will. And so one of the ways I proposed to remedy that was through this series of classes. So today, we're doing the voice of longing, and it was the natural one in the last triad who did reason, conscience, and longing. So if you're clever, you hear echoes of the true, the good, and the beautiful there. The voice of longing, and longing is related to beauty. The longings of the heart. Our conscience commands, but beauty draws. And I used an example of this last week. But when we're raising young children, we give lots of commands in the imperative mood. Do this, don't do that, put that down, shut up and tie your shoes. All of that, the voice of command. And longing is very, very different. And the whole of the religious tradition asserts that there is a natural longing for God. In other words, this is in our souls somehow. We're born with it. It doesn't mean that we come out of the crib longing for God, but it does mean that it's virtually there, that as we mature and develop as human beings, we will discover that longing in our own time. And so this first section is called The Voice of Natural Longing, page 31. And what I mean by that word natural is that all people in all places throughout all history have this. It doesn't have to be wakened through divine revelation from the outside. Now, I do believe there is such a thing. The gospel message, when it comes to us from the outside, awakens something in us that wasn't there before. Anybody who's sat through an altar call or in a church service or gone to a Billy Graham crusade and has heard the gospel preached knows what it's like to be stirred in a way that you've never been stirred before. But this here would apply to all peoples, and so in a lot of these lessons I divide it up that way. In philosophy, if you've ever taken a philosophy class, I've taught a few of them, they call this aesthetics. Theory of what is beautiful. Aesthetics. And a lot of times in those kinds of classes, we investigate what is the nature of beauty, what are the properties that a thing must have before we call it beautiful. Now that becomes immediately a controversial issue. If you go to a museum, you can see a beautiful painting, or a beautiful statue, or you can listen to a beautiful piece of music. And for a long time, there was general agreement that certain qualities attach themselves to things that were properly regarded as beautiful. But if you've been in the modern art section of the museum, you've probably seen a few things that you've wondered, what's this doing here? Maybe there's a philosophical reason behind why it's there, but it's directly challenging our conventional ideas of beauty. Now, I'm not against all modern art, literature, or music. I think some of it's actually quite good, even some of the abstract stuff. But you do know there's a line where you cross over into an area where you feel like you're being kind of bungled. You know, they're tricking you, pressuring you to saying something is really a great work of art when it's nothing of the kind. So if there, you know, and so I guess the question is, take one of my favorite pieces of music, which is Beethoven's Third Symphony, the Eroica, the first movement, I think is one of the most beautiful pieces of music ever written. And I don't think that's just my opinion. If somebody else listens to this music and doesn't like it, then I will say there's something wrong with them. They're not appreciating what's going on in this piece of music. You got to be careful about that because people do have tastes. Some people like vanilla, some like chocolate. But at a certain level, you might say if something is truly beautiful, then it calls forth our admiration. And if we don't admire it, then it isn't the fault of the object. It's our fault. We may not have the sensitivity to appreciate it. That's fine. But it isn't because everything's subjective. There are some things that are really, really beautiful. And there are some things that are really, really ugly. And this gets tricky. I've talked with a few of you after church because many of us have seen the musical Les Miserables, which I think is a beautiful musical, but it includes within it a lot of things that are ugly. If you've seen the musical, you know that there's a lot of, there's violence and there is betrayal and there is anguish and there is prostitution and poverty and all kinds of ugliness within that. But if you watch the musical beginning to end, it's overwhelmingly beautiful. And Victor Hugo, who wrote the book, the musicals based on his book, argued in an essay that you can incorporate ugliness into things that are beautiful. The same way a jazz musician can put dissonant chords into his music. Now, he must resolve them. He can't just bang on the piano and make noise. But he can include dissonance in beautiful music. And many of you have, there's some of that in Beethoven's Third Symphony, what they call the guillotine chords. There's 7 really nasty, ugly chords that come chopping down in the middle of that. And the first time you hear it, it's just kind of takes your breath away. But he weaves it in to his piece. Poetry of T.S. Eliot is like that. Very, very modern poet, not very classical, and there's a lot of jangling that goes on in his poetry. If you've read The Waste Land, is probably his most famous. But it's a good poem. It's a short poem, about 1.5 pages to 2 pages. I have to say, the first time I read it, it took me weeks to get through it, even though it was only a couple pages, because there's so much going on in it. I practically needed my whole library to figure out what he was talking about every other stanza. It's a really, really great poem, but you don't just sit down and read it like, a Wordsworth poem or a more classical poem. Those take time too, but they're not as abstruse. So we have this idea of the beauty and the longing. There's beauty in nature that is already there. And then there's beauty that we as human beings create through the arts, whether music or literature or art. In my own bit of fiction, I was thinking of that a moment ago, and I'm working on another piece. It has ugliness in it, and sometimes Christians ask me, how do you as a pastor write these kinds of books? How do you think your way through that? And I often mention Victor Hugo's essay because I do think that good Christian literature can incorporate ugliness into it as long as it's in the service of some higher beauty. So there that is. On page 32, there are many different forms, I mentioned this last week, of longing, and many different objects that meet those longings. We have longing for food, and for sleep, and for sex, for a friend, for a spouse, for a purpose. All of those are things that human beings long for, and there are objects that correspond to that longing. If you're dying of hunger, you can always pick up a Big Mac. But I don't think anybody would call it fine cuisine. And that's why when you oftentimes eat at a nice restaurant, they try to take the edge off your appetite a little bit so that you don't just gobble the food down. And you can actually appreciate what it tastes like. Same thing. There is beauty in friendship. A harsh movie, but one about friendship that I think is a great film about friendship, was The Shawshank Redemption. It's a harsh movie in a lot of ways, but it's fundamentally a movie about friendship. And the ending of the movie, which passes through all of the difficulties of the major characters, is really, really tender. It's a wonderful, wonderful film. And the list goes on, but for the classical thinkers, you can arrange the different things of beauty in a scale from lowest to highest. So the lowest beauties would be those that we share with the animal kingdom. Fundamental basic things like food and sex. Animals have this, humans have it. But then we have a level of desire on the human level that the animals do not share, for friendship, for purpose. And if we're looking for a spouse, not just for sexual reasons, but you look for a life partner. Eros, the old Greek word, unfortunately has passed into English through the word erotic, and so it only seems to mean sex. But in the original Greek language, eros refers to the love of the other person's personality. So the love between souls. And Plato talks a lot about that in his dialogues. They have the expression Platonic love, which is a love for the other person that doesn't have any connection with our animal drives and passions. So the idea there is that you can arrange the objects of beauty on a scale from lowest to highest, and eventually you come to what the classical theorists call the sublime. And the object of that at the highest level is going to be God. Now, the sublime is not a word that gets used very much anymore here on page 32. But the lesser forms of beauty are recognized by the fact that they evoke simple feelings of desire. The sublime is marked by the evocation of a more complicated feeling of a mixture of attraction and repulsion at the same time. So the highest forms of desire have an admixture of the opposite. good example will be if you're standing on the Grand Canyon, you may be overwhelmed with the beauty of what you see. You may also feel very small and maybe a little afraid. Anybody seen something that was very beautiful that also felt slightly terrifying at the same time? And that heightens the feeling of beauty, and there's a word for that. The idea of sublimity is the idea of something that is beautiful in such a way that it is so far beyond us that it could even possibly pose a threat to us. It's that powerful. And there's where you reach the highest level of beauty. And they have a word for it. It's the sublime. So people misuse words these days, you know. If they have a good bowl of mac and cheese, they say it's epic. And therefore they drag the wonderful word epic into the pit of their own linguistic inadequacy, and they ruin words. A bowl of mac and cheese is not epic. Epics are epic, but nobody knows what an epic is anymore. So the sublime is a very, very important word. I had trouble finding very many people who wrote about this subject. It's an exalted subject. Edmund Burke wrote an essay on the sublime. He was during the days of the good old American Revolution, when we were throwing off the shackles of the British king, Edmund Burke was in Parliament in Britain, was a sympathizer with what we were doing here in America. So, of course, I like him. He also opposed the French Revolution. He thought that that was a bad idea. But Edmund Burke was a great political philosopher. He also wrote some essays on this. Rudolf Otto wrote a number of works on ancient religion, which we talked about earlier, how in the ancient world people built altars on high mountaintops or in secluded groves of trees or in caves with springs and pools of water, those kinds of secret places that, especially if you remember as small children, what it's like to be off by yourself in a secret place, that evoke powerful feelings of sublimity. And Immanuel Kant, of course. C.S. Lewis, a more modern writer, and I have a quote from him here. He says the sublime is not merely a matter of personal interest, but he felt it was important for Christian theology in general and had an important role to play in the development of individuals. He says in Mere Christianity, his famous work, if I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. And that's his argument from desire. For C.S. Lewis, like St. Augustine before him, his religious journey was really a journey of trying his passions out with the different things in life, and then discovering over the course of time that all of that was great and everything, but that there was still something left out. That there was still something, there was a desire he had that nothing could satisfy. Married couples sometimes discover this. Not always easy to know how to put it, but sometimes when you get married to a person, there's a lot of wonderful things that happen, even in the best of all possible marriages, but there might be something that you were looking to get out of that marriage that no marriage to anybody else on the planet could ever satisfy. Everybody understand what I'm talking about? Okay. A lot of times as human beings, we have supernatural longings, and we try to get them out of something. And only through difficult experience do we discover that that object cannot satisfy what it was that we're looking for. Now, it can satisfy any number of other things. So it's not a strike against marriage or the toy that you wanted for Christmas when you were a kid, or the job that you thought would solve everything, or for ambitious souls, they have this idea that if they only achieve this thing, then their life, they'll look in the mirror one day and they'll realize that they've arrived. And that's hardly ever what happens. They commit suicide after that because they've reached the top and they realize, what did the orangutan say in the Jungle Book? He reached the top and he had to stop. What's the name of that orangutan? All right. What's that? That's it, King Louis. All right. So in Pilgrim's Regress, that's not one of C.S. Lewis's more well-known books. That was his first published book. He wrote it. It's the first book he wrote after his conversion. I like it very much. Not many people even know it exists. He speaks of a recurrent experience which dominated his childhood and which was evoked by the beauty he found in nature and literature. So when C.S. Lewis was a young boy, there was an experience he recurrently had, and there were certain things that awakened it. Oftentimes it was something in nature or literature. Literature had power to awaken this in him. And as he got older, it became fainter and fainter and fainter and harder to get. And he talks about this in this book. One of the reasons why I like this book is because I had this exact same experience. And I was surprised to find that anybody else had had it or was even competent to write about it. That carries over in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe story with the idea that there are these special moments when the children enter into this magical world through the wardrobe. But once they come out of it, they can never get into Narnia the same way. They can't go back and repeat the experience. And many of us have had that experience of something powerful and magical that happened in our life, and we try to recapture it, but the way we did it the first time doesn't work anymore. And so that experience becomes fainter and fainter and fainter. And so he writes, it is distinguished from other longings by two things. Two things he thinks set it apart. In the first place, the sense of want is acute and even painful, yet the mere wanting is somehow felt a delight. Other desires are felt as pleasures only if satisfaction is expected in the near future. Hunger is pleasant only while we know we are soon going to eat. But this desire, even when there is no hope of possible satisfaction, continues to be prized and even to be preferred to anything else in the world by those who have once felt it. So it's a longing for an object that is its own delight. Most longings are happy when they get what they want. And C.S. Lewis is saying this longing is delightful even in the absence of the object. And the second thing that he says is there's a peculiar mystery about the object of the desire. Inexperienced people and inattention leaves some inexperienced all their lives. Suppose when they feel it that they know what they want. Thus, if it comes to a child while he is looking for a far-off hillside, he thinks, if only I were there. If it comes when he's remembering some event in the past, he thinks, if only I could go back. If it comes when he's reading a romantic tale, he thinks he's wishing that such places really existed and that he could reach them. So the two things is that the longing is mysterious, and the object of the longing is mysterious. C.S. Lewis here is really setting us up. He believes that God is the object of this longing, and that God is beyond this world, and that accounts for the peculiar nature of this experience. I want to read a little bit off of page 33, but before I do, let me stop, because I've talked a little bit about beauty and longing and aesthetics and nature and art and the intermingling of the beautiful and the ugly and the sublime. And I got to stop and catch my breath and say, well, if there's any questions or comments, because I feel like I'm wading into the deep end of the pool here. And there might be some who are like, you lost me in the first 5 minutes there. The teachers at the school where I teach took a trip to Kirk of the Hills this week. Anybody been to Kirk of the Hills? Wonderful, wonderful. And we had a tour guide, and she was talking about this painting and that statue and this column here. And when I went into the main sanctuary, I just sat on the pew and looked at the stained glass and the architecture and just kind of, yeah, it was great. And you could talk about it and everything, and that was cool, but in a way the talk seemed to diminish it, take away from it. I enjoyed it very much. Though I did hunt around. You know, they have some artwork in there from the 12th century. It is a long time ago. And I talked to the tour guide afterward. I said, the guy who built this place, his name was Colonel someone from Europe, came over to America, worked in the car industry. I was mostly interested in where he got all his money. It's like this place didn't come out of nowhere. It was built in the 50s. I didn't realize it was built in the 50s. That was when they started. He was attending a Presbyterian church in Detroit, and he didn't like the commute. So he decided to build a church near his house, which is about a mile from here. And that became the beginning of Kirk of the Hills. That's something. And he brought in all kinds of artwork from Western Europe and had professional stonemasons, and architects, and people to create the stained glass, and it grew and it grew and it grew. And it's probably, since it was built in the 50s, I would guess it's probably the last Gothic piece of architecture built in the whole of the United States. I don't think there's any built after that. I would have to double check that, but very, very interesting. Top of page 33. If we have a natural longing for something, then there's an object that satisfies it. That was important to C.S. Lewis. If I have a desire for food, there is food in the world. Lo and behold. Now, that's not the same as an artificial desire. And I mentioned this last week. The desire to see Santa Claus is an artificial desire. Nobody is born with it. You have to have parents who deliberately deceive you into thinking that there is a fat elf who will come down your chimney once a year, and if you tell him what you want for Christmas, Andy's eyes grew wide there. You know there's no Santa Claus, right?
Disillusion. I mean,
you came in the wrong day. Came in the wrong day. So, Freud, the great Viennese psychologist, argued that God is not really a natural desire at all. It's a projection of our desire for a father figure. And so Freud believed that we could get along fairly well without the idea of God because it's just psychologically damaged people who need to believe that there's a father figure who they never had, and they create this idea of God. And that was popular in Freud's time. C.S. Lewis doesn't agree with that, obviously, but that's the theory. On Freud's view, then, the desire for God is enculturated. It's something we learn, but it's not natural to us. And C.S. Lewis wants to argue the exact opposite. He thinks all people have it, and it's the most natural thing in the world, in fact. And there you have it. He writes here on page 33, all in italics, every one of these supposed objects for the desire is inadequate to it. He's talking about his own longing for God and his own desire to squeeze out of life something that would satisfy him. An easy experiment will show that by going to the far hillside, you will get either nothing or else a recurrence of the same desire which sent you hither. Desire would have disappeared, would have shifted its ground like the cuckoo's voice or the rainbow's end, and now be calling us from beyond a further hill. So that's analogous to the idea I said about our moral conscience, which is such a pesky thing, because the moment we satisfy the demands of our conscience raises yet further demands. And once we satisfy those demands, our conscience raises yet further demands, like climbing a hill, only to get to the top and see 20 more hills further in the distance. We learn that we can never satisfy our moral conscience. It will drive us to greater and greater demands. And C.S. Lewis is saying the same thing here about desire. The moment our desires are satisfied, we're longing for something else. And he doesn't think that that's a sign that this whole life is a trick. He thinks it's a sign that this life is educating us to something beyond the threshold of this world, which I think is a very, very interesting idea. It appeared to me, therefore, that if a man diligently followed this desire, pursuing the false objects until their falsity appeared, and then resolutely abandoning them, he must come out at last into the clear knowledge that the human soul was made to enjoy some object that is never fully given, nay, cannot even be imagined as given in our present spatial temporal existence. This desire was in the soul, as the siege perilous in Arthur's castle, the chair in which only one could sit, and if nature making nothing in vain, then one who can sit in this chair must exist. I mention that there because C.S. Lewis is such a fascinating character, and because for all his apologetic works like Mere Christianity and the other books that he wrote, it's evident that his religious journey was largely of this sort. Trying different things out in life, being repeatedly disappointed, and longing for something beyond. So I call this on page 33 a lived dialectic, or a lived argument for God's existence. You argue, does God exist, does God not exist, and you present arguments. But this is a lived argument, and that you live it out. And that's true even in my own case. I'm going to teach an apologetics course this year at the school. And I will present the students with traditional arguments for God's existence. The ontological argument, the cosmological argument, and the moral argument, and all of these other things. Now, some student is inevitably going to ask me if these arguments are the reason why I believe in God. And I will probably say, no. I think they're good arguments. The next question can be, well, why do we bother with this stuff if, that's not the point? I think they show that belief in God is rational. Because sometimes people get the idea that religious belief is just totally irrational. And it's not. There are good reasons for religious belief. But the question is, what is decisive for a person? What enables them to make a decision to believe? So you're never pulled by sheer weight of evidence into belief into something like God. There has to be something personal at stake. And in this regard, C.S. Lewis is simply walking in the footsteps of the great saints throughout history. St. Augustine is the most famous, and his Confessions talks about his journey of looking for happiness and not finding it. St. Augustine was a very unhappy man, and it wasn't for lack of looking. He chased down everything that he could think of, and he lived it to the full. And he had a lot of good, finite, enjoyable experiences along the way. He didn't look back and say it didn't mean anything. They were enjoyable while they lasted. But in the end, he felt driven to the idea that he was made for something more. In the medieval period, Thomas Aquinas, in his usual way, ties everything up in a tidy little bow of a single sentence or two. That's what Thomas Aquinas does, and he says, "The knowledge that God exists is inborn in us in a general and somewhat confused manner. For God is the final beatitude, substitute the word happiness, of man. And man desires beatitude, substitute the word happiness, naturally, and is naturally aware of what he desires." Aquinas is saying, everybody wants to be happy. And whether they know it or not, the knowledge of God is hidden in that desire. Because nothing will make them happy in this world. That's an interesting idea. Very, very interesting idea. Now, I'm going to ask Joe. Joe, you're here today, and I have to ask you, you get clients who come in and say they just want to be happy?
All the time.
All the time. And what do you think when you hear that? You're like, that'll be $20. You can't really provide them with that.
No.
And many of our psychological difficulties and our practical difficulties come, I would guess, out of trying to squeeze happiness out of something that can't provide it. Now, I'm not in your shoes, but that would be very, very difficult. Now, if somebody comes in and says, "I just want to be happy," do you have a line that you use after that?
How much time do you have?
How much time do you have? What is the object that will create happiness? A lot of times, the closest we can get in this life is the perfect relationship with another human person. But even that, even if it's a good one, I don't think will provide happiness. And that's part of Jesus' teaching in the Gospels, that when we do get to heaven, marriage will be gone. He says they will neither be given or received in marriage, but we will become like the angels. And what is he saying there? He's saying that even marriage is mortal. It's something that we do in our time here on earth, and it's one of the highest expressions of human life that are available to us in this present life. But even that will pass away. So last paragraph on page 33. The voice of longing draws us toward God. How do we enter into conversation with the other voices of God? The voice of reason, the voice of conscience, the voice of longing are all of the ones that we've talked about. I think reason alone can tell us that there is a God. That doesn't mean it's psychologically persuasive. There's a difference between whether something is reasonable and whether we'll go with it or not. And I think the voice of conscience can tell us what God's moral requirements are, though, of course, to put it in a nutshell, they're infinite. The moral requirement upon us. If we wanted to look at what would happen to the person who lived in this life, the morally perfect life, we're going to be led to the example of Jesus. And that should make all of us really worried. We don't want to live that life. And in a fallen world, the life of Jesus essentially is saying, if you were to live and satisfy the full demands of what God requires of you, it would mean total self-sacrifice. So I think that should get us out from under the idea that we're going to be able to do this, that it's in our power to do this. The whole Christian gospel is based on the idea that we do not have the power to do this. Only God can accomplish it, and therefore we participate in what He has won for us through His sacrifice, but we can't do it. It's not just, being a good citizen is not enough. Making your friend group happy is not enough. Obeying the rules of your school is not enough. There's more and more and more that is demanded. And then the voice of longing also tells us that ultimately our desire in this life cannot be satisfied by anything in this world. Top of page 34. Blaise Pascal, great French mathematician. Anybody ever do Pascal's triangle? All right. Pascal. There is sufficient light for those who desire to see, and sufficient dark for those of a contrary disposition. Pascal is saying, some people are going to be religious, some people are going to not be religious. You're never going to persuade them with reasons. If you want to see, there's enough light for you to see. If you want to remain in darkness, there's enough darkness for you to remain in the darkness. There, Pascal is simply pointing out that people are going to follow their own moral disposition. I think the way we put it these days is people believe what they want to believe. People believe what they want to believe. So I think arguments for God's existence can help people who want to believe, because it can show them that they're not crazy, that they are rational, intelligent people, and that when other people attack them, and they will be attacked, if you embrace religious belief, you're going to be attacked. People are going to attack you. So these arguments can persuade believers that, no, their head is screwed on correctly. They're not crazy. But that's not how they came to that belief in the first place. So second paragraph on page 34 kind of summarizes. The voice of reason persuades us of the existence of a supreme mind, but cannot tell us what, if anything, this mind feels, intends, or does. We know there's a God, but we don't know anything about Him through the voice of reason. The voice of conscience can tell us that He demands justice, but the demands of justice are beyond our ability to satisfy, so the person who genuinely, passionately lives a moral life is going to end with guilt and the highest pitch of their life will be hope for some sort of rescue beyond themselves. And the voice of longing can tell us that God alone, is the source of our happiness, cannot empower us to lay hold of Him. The uttermost of man's ability for all that he can know and do and feel. He cannot take hold of God. Oh, I get into a little relativity here. Like the speed of light, the object of his pursuit retreats at its classical velocity. On the basis of mystical experience, he supposes that he is already united with the divine. His moral failings falsify that claim. But if he seeks by moral effort to make himself worthy of it, he can get no further than the conviction of his own guilt and hope in divine providence. If he seeks by rational inquiry to penetrate into the divine mystery of providence, the only oracle he receives is wait on the Lord. So I guess with the voice of reason, the voice of conscience, and the voice of longing, all of those things all human beings have. In the East and in the West, in all centuries, all races, all people at all time, but it raises more questions than it answers. But therein is the role of religious longing. It is a prophetic anticipation of God's revelation, which is to say His intervention into the history of man. Simone Weil writes, "The danger is not lest the soul should doubt whether there is any bread, but lest by a lie it should persuade itself that it is not hungry." Famous quote. She's arguing that the real danger is that we convince ourselves that we have no such longing for the beyond. Accordingly, it is in longing that the soul stands in readiness for God's revelation. Matthew 13:17, "Truly I tell you, many prophets and righteous men longed to see what you see, but did not see it, and hear what you hear, but did not hear it." So next week, this lesson is going to be called The Voice of Natural Longing. Next week, I want to talk about the faith of ancient Israel and the person of Jesus, because what this does is it is an answer to a question that the human soul asks. And this lesson is in many ways preparation for that. So, the God Speaks lessons up to this point have largely been concerned with the ways in which God speaks to all people in all places and all times, not just Christians, not just Jews. But in the lessons upcoming, I'll talk more and more about that side of it. Let me see if there's any question or comment. And if not, we'll go. Some of you are longing for food. All right, let me say a word of prayer and I'll let you go.